People who have seen something they could never explain. What was the thing? A tree fell in front of us while we were driving. It almost killed us. Moments later, a group of men dressed in nice clothes just happened to have chainsaws in their car. That was black and black tinted windows. They started cutting up the tree. We quickly turned around and said nope. I tried to tell myself that it was just Mormons, who happened to have chainsaws in the back of their car. I called my mom the other day to see if she still remembers that incident, and she does. Having grown up very rural, I've definitely heard of stories like, well, we were on the way to the funeral when the tree falls across the road. Luckily, we had the chainsaws from last night. Literally my cousin, well, we were on our way to the hospital, but my wife started giving birth in the back of the truck, so we just pulled into a parking lot, and luckily I still had all the calving supplies in the bed. Kid's fine by the way, he's like 11 now and awesome. Now if it had been a redneck in a pickup truck, I'd totally believe they already had a chainsaw in the back and were willing to cut up the tree, cause they're usually helpful like that, but a group of guys in nice clothes with a chainsaw is disturbing lol. Short version, 14 years old, pretending to sleep at a friend's house and instead walking around the city, Colorado Springs, Colorado, at around 3 a.m., and suddenly for about 2 to 3 minutes it's bright as day across the whole city. I could clearly see mountains probably 5 miles away. And then poof, back to dark. There was no obvious source of the light. That was around 35 years ago. Still have no clue what it was. Edit, surprised this post got any attention. Also amazed at how many others had very similar experiences. Agree with the feedback suggesting a meteorite is the most likely explanation. It was not a cloudy night, so I think electrical ground source bouncing off clouds is less likely. Those suggesting iridium satellites. This was mid to late 80s, so I don't think they launched yet. And yeah, there's a ton of military stuff in the area. NORAD, the Air Force Academy, Peterson AFB, and I think a few others were mentioned. I think these are less likely than a meteorite because of how far up and down the mountain range I could see. Also, folks mentioning a meteorite probably wouldn't last 2 to 3 minutes. I think my time perception could be off. I froze up and just stared at the basin floor of the city and the very prominent mountains for however long it was. It felt like a few minutes, but maybe it wasn't? The odd thing with any explanation is that the light source was clearly on my side of the Rocky Mountains. The whole front range was visible, so the source seems like it had to be from above. Yet I couldn't see any point of light in the sky where intuition says it had to be. Still, I suppose they've been nestled behind some geography that blocked my view but didn't block it casting light on the basin of the city/mountain range. That seems plausible. You are still in the dream state before final death after the nuclear apocalypse of 1988. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you're dead, buddy. Meteorite burning up in the atmosphere most likely. Saw a video recently of this happening in India. Went from pitch black to nearly daylight. How often can that happen? I've witnessed something similar, but I'm not sure if it was also a meteorite incident. I fly helicopters for a living. I was working on a power line one year and was going back to our landing zone and noticed an opening in the trees, what appeared to be a leg. I came back and tried to get as low as I could into the clearing, thinking it was a person. It was a full-grown cow that had been completely skinned. There were no farms around and the animal didn't appear to be cut up in any way. I went back to the landing zone, picked up one of my ground crew members and flew back with him just so he could verify that I wasn't crazy. The flight back, we were both kind of in awe because we have no idea how that animal got to where it's at. Even more so that it had no skin on its entire body. It looked like a perfect cow sand skin. I knew someone once who was illegally flying a small aircraft, very rural area, and, for a variety of reasons, had a ton of shrimp on board. The aircraft started losing altitude and they decided to lighten the load by throwing the shrimp overboard. It left a lot of locals very confused about a large amount of raw shrimp in the trees. Maybe the cow didn't go up. A skinwalker decided to go cow for the afternoon. Or someone skinned a cow in the middle of the woods because where else can you practice skinning things? It sounds like he was working in a rural area, so I feel someone with access to a full cow already has their own land to practice on. A voice sounding like my friend's sister calling out his name from a tree line in a park. Me and friend were walking home near the middle of the night, both of us heard it. He was called out 3 times. Crazy how you always hear these stories. I heard my wife calling me from the basement, but she was out of town or similar. The story always ends with, I was super freaked out so I ran. We never hear the perspective of somebody who approached the voice. Those who approach the voice do not live to tell. I spend a fair bit of time camping, and hearing what clearly sounds like human voices when there are no humans is very unsettling. I think it's often just the wind, with your brain filling in the gaps and interpreting these soft broken noises as voices, like that thing where we see faces in things that are really just random. I was standing on the seaside walkway with a bunch of other people watching the sunset. A red orb came speeding down the coastline at like 50 to 150 meters altitude. Didn't think much of it until it instantly stopped and speeded back the way it came until it was out of sight. No noise, too low for a plane or helicopter, and wasn't a flare because it was flying fast, stopped instantly and then flew back the way it came. Several people saw it, but this was before mobile phones with cameras were a mainstream thing. I've seen the same thing, but in red and green. It was probably around 1 a.m. I was outside with my 2 friends, but when I saw it I was alone. I looked out at the sky over a few houses and I saw a red ball/diamond looking thing. And I thought it was a meteor or shooting star at first, but it also had this long disappearing green trail following it. The thing shot down into like the middle of the sky, then shot right back up just as fast. It was super quick and was over in like 2 seconds. Crazy shit. Edit. I honestly can't remember if the ball was red and the trail was green or vice versa, but it's one of those lol. Saw exactly the same thing you described, the green orb. 12 to 1 a.m. or something during a barbecue with the missus. It had a green trail and not like fairy glitter type trail. 2 to 3 seconds like yours. Happened back in August 2022 I think. Malaysian BTW. Edit. Wife saw it too. We were chillin' on the hammock when we saw it. She was angry at me because I had acknowledged the presence of the orb. Malays to be precise have this weird rule to never acknowledge weird stuff happening around us, especially if you're in the wild. Just let it happen and ignore it. Lol. Deleted. Was talking on the phone to my dad in the garden, about 15 years ago. Saw an orange light slowly come up over some trees behind my house then take off straight up at a ridiculous speed. Stood there in silence and so did he. Explained to him what I'd just seen and he said he'd just seen the exact same thing. He was over 100 miles away in Manchester at the time. Sounds like a meteor that hit the atmosphere and got deflected. Its trajectory was towards you at first. So from your POV it would have looked relatively still then suddenly shooting upward. Deflected? That happens? My parents have seen exactly the same thing. I live outside city limits. There are very few houses near my home and many tall bushes and trees around the house. There is a small mountain at some distance. The nights are very quiet and there is no street lights, so after dark the only lights are the lights from my house and the moonlight. There are 2 trees a little far from my house that are standing close to one another. One night while I was outside my house with a flashlight doing something I realized there was only one of those trees. I looked around that tree with my flashlight but there was no sign of the other tree, like it never existed. The next day I went there during daytime to see exactly what happened to the other tree and they both were there just like I remembered. I looked around them and even climbed on them to see anything strange but nothing was out of ordinary. Sorry about this bug in your simulation, we usually patch servers during the night time. For more details watch The Truman Show. This could have been an ocular migraine. I had one once that caused everything to the right of my center vision to be entirely faked by my brain. As if my right eye had entirely turned off and everything it should have been seeing was just CGI faked in, and there was no way to tell other than some discrepancies. I went across a road, looked left, clear, looked right, clear and stepped out into the road. Except when looking right my brain knew what the road looked like, so gave me an entirely fake image of that road with no cars in it, when there were actually several cars coming that nearly ran me over. I had to turn around to face the other way so the road was on my left to actually see what was on the road. On the same walk, there was a lamp post by the path. If I looked very slightly to the left of the lamp post, the entire thing disappeared as if it were entirely invisible, whilst everything looked entirely normal. One night, years after high school and I'd gotten married, I had a vivid and very sad dream about the first boyfriend I ever really loved. We were 15 and 16. Broke up about 3 years later because he really got into drugs. I had this dream maybe 9 years after that. I dreamed I was walking down a crowded sidewalk in some big city and I bumped into him going the direction I just came from. He was crying and he asked me for help. I can't remember if the dream changed then or I woke up, but it was just that little snippet of seeing his face. It was so clear. I still remember how his beautiful blue eyes looked. I don't know why I waited a couple more years to call his mother and ask about him one day when I recalled that dream for some reason. But I did call her. It turns out he had died in a freak accident around the time I had that dream. He had a car in his garage that he was working on. He had climbed on the hood for some reason, to do something, and he fell, broke his neck and it was fatal. Now I'm always sad and a little creeped out every time I think of that dream. Probably always will be. A very similar thing happened to my father when he was around 18 years old. He was at home, sleeping, and woke up suddenly around 2 a.m., thinking of his best friend, who was in trouble in his dream. He tried to call his friend in the morning, and it turns out his best friend died from a car crash at 2 a.m., precisely when he had that dream. I wouldn't call myself deeply spiritual or religious or anything, and at one point in time I was a fairly outspoken atheist, but as I've gotten older, I've gotten less certain. Stories like this resonate a little harder, I guess, Like love and connection to people is a real psychic bond that we can't fully explain or measure. Like our existence as sapient, social animals has a latent metaphysical level that we can't consciously access but can accidentally brush against. It's weird, I guess, but beautiful in a sense, the idea that our kinship with one another can transcend the natural and call out, or say goodbye, to our loved ones in death. Similar thing happened to me. I dated this girl just out of high school. She's the one that got away. She had an opportunity to go to a dance school and get the fuck out of our tiny hometown. So she pursued her dream. I went to college. We didn't talk for over a decade. Both got married, had kids. Then like 2 years ago I had this super vivid dream of her walking by a lake we used to go to. She said, "Don't let me go." I tried to hold onto her hand, but she just kind of faded. It was really sad. I found out months later that she died from a brain aneurysm around the same time I had the dream. In college my wife, girlfriend at the time, had a nightmare that her pet iguana, at home with her father, had frozen to death after being left outside. She woke up sobbing and that woke me up. I calmed her down and told her it was just a dream. We both eventually got back to sleep. The next morning her father called to say that her pet iguana had been left outside overnight and had frozen to death. This wasn't a recurring dream or worry for her. This was the only time it happened. Neither of us can explain the events without the aid of religion or 1 in a trillion coincidence. The night my dad died, he came to me in a dream. He told me, very matter-of-factly, that he had died. He was healthy in the dream, unlike in real life. He was dressed in a light gray suit with a matching Panama hat, sunglasses with a newspaper. He was sitting at a small table, like a bistro, overlooking a beach. He explained to me that all of time and space were like fibers in a muscle lattice, all running in tandem and all happening at once. Death is when you're removed from the electric impulse in the lattice, and become the lattice itself. He told me the rest of my life will seem long to me, but will only be moments for him, and when I die, we will see each other again. We said our goodbyes and my mom woke me up. She told me your father has passed away through tears and a shaking voice. I said when? Thinking this was something that had happened a long time ago. She said she didn't know and it took me the better part of an hour to realize that it had happened that night. I'm almost the same age now as he was when I was born. This happened nearly 20 years ago, but I remember that dream quite vividly. The next year after his death is almost entirely a blur. My mom did the same thing about the president of the Mormon church. She was Mormon back in the day. Asked my grandma if the president of the church was still alive, and grandma was like yeah. The next morning my mom awoke to grandma shaking her awake, frantically asking why did you ask me that question yesterday? The president of the Mormon church died that night and grandma heard about it the next morning. Coincidence in my mind, but sure a weird one. Seems about the right spot in the post. My grandma and I were at the dinner table eating, and I hear her say under her voice, "Lord, please take me." Finished and went to bed, and went to school too. I get called to the office and find out my grandma died that very night. She was very frail because of alcoholism, but I was in 3rd grade and know what I heard. 2 missing hours, I posted about it on another account. Setup, I used to be a home health aide for the disabled/elderly. I stayed overnights to help them get up, use the restroom, change, clean them, etc. I used to take care of a man named Mr. M. We kept an old large clock alarm that chimed every hour. Every 2 hours we'd roll Mr. M over, and change his pads. We recorded everything that happened in a notebook by the clock. Story, it was a usual day until around 2 a.m. I heard the chimes ring, twice, wrote down that I was going in, then went in, wrote what I did, changed his pads, wrote the time I got done, then went back to the kitchen where I sat every night, having my laptop set up to pass the time. About 15 minutes pass, and I hear the clock chime again, 4 times. I look at my computer, thinking the clock was wrong, and no. 4 a.m. I look at the notes, no new notes. I write that I'm going and I go in to change Mr. M's pads. I walk in, and he looks at me and asks, "Weren't you just in here?" I said yay, then went with changing his pads. They were dry, a rarity. I still have no idea what happened to those 2 hours. It was like 2 hours passed in 15 minutes, and 3 o'clock was skipped completely. I was watching a YouTube series at the time, and my video would have ended in that 2 hours. I have no idea to this day what the hell happened. / to those suggesting a time change / DST, this happened December 11, 2016. I don't know why this terrified me so much, but it did. I've seen stories of lost time here on Reddit, so yeah, you're not alone, and this is the one thing that's so hard to rationalize for me. Ghost, creepy sounds, etc. could just be the product of a hyperactive imagination, or in some cases, hallucination. But what on earth makes people lose time like that? I honestly don't know what happened to this day. Nothing like that has happened since that I'm aware of, but the one time it did sticks out so much. Possible explanations. 1. You and Mr. M fell asleep for about the same amount of time those 2 hours. You woke up and realized you were missing your videos because you were asleep and restarted them from a known point. You were still dozing and forgot you reset it, and the 4 a.m. chime went off a little bit later. His confirmation that it also seemed short reinforced the idea of missed time. If he would have said no, it's been 2 hours, or if he told you that it felt like 15 minutes when 2 hours had clearly gone by, you might have said no, you must have fallen asleep. The clean pad reinforced that idea as well. 2. Springtime change. It hit 2 a.m. Sunday morning and it skipped ahead to 3 a.m., which is the typical daylight savings adjustment time. You lost some time dozing maybe, but maybe not as much, and when 1 hour is presented to you as 2 hours it might feel more compressed than that. Seems less likely with an old clock that chimes, though, that it would also track daylight savings. 3. Aliens. I worked as an under-butler in a large Scottish castle in the early 2000s. One night, I was the only person in the house, and decided to throw a load of laundry in before bed. I walked down to service hallway, into the ironing room, and from there to the washing machine room. I got my laundry in, and then started to leave. I turned the lights off in the washing machine room, and suddenly everything was black. The lights weren't on in the ironing room. My first thought was, it's weird that I didn't turn the lights on in here when I came in, but they aren't on, so obviously I didn't. The ironing room had huge ironing tables the size of snooker tables, and as I started to walk through, I kept bumping into them. After a couple of times of bumping into them, I was suddenly filled with a terrible, accompanied, watched, spine-tingling feeling that something was there, and not to look toward the sewing room, another room that came off the ironing room. I fumbled my way through the ironing room, back to the service hall in a panic. The hall lights were on and everything was fine. That is the whole story. I didn't see anything. However, there are some problems. To this day, I am confident that I turned the lights on in the ironing room when I went in. It wasn't possible to move through the room without bumping into things a bunch of times, as my exit demonstrated. The light in the ironing room was controlled by a very large switch that made a loud clicking noise. I didn't hear it click off when I was in the washing room. In the days that followed, the family and the butler returned home, and I had forgotten about the entire incident. A week or so later, I suddenly remembered it happening, and said to the butler, "I've never heard of any ghost stories at the castle. Are there any?" He kind of dismissively said, "Oh, they say there is a white lady in the ballroom, and, room name redacted, is apparently haunted, but that's it. Oh, and they say the sewing room is haunted." I kind of gasped and told the butler the story. He seemed fascinated. He told the family, and a couple of them agreed that the laundry room was unsettling. I don't believe in ghosts, and think it was likely an unfortunately timed electrical fault and an overactive imagination. Still, I'll never forget how sudden and strong the feeling of a presence was when I was fumbling my way out of the ironing room. There's no feeling quite like the fear you feel when you think something is there. Like they say, you're not afraid of being alone in the dark, you're afraid of not being alone in the dark. American here, what exactly is an under-butler? It sounds amazing to have access like that to a castle. I was walking along a park sidewalk blowing off grass clippings, got under some pine trees and through a break in the canopy an 8 to 10 pound rock came tumbling out of the sky, bounced and chipped the sidewalk and rolled down into a creek. Weirdest thing I've ever seen. Trebuchet range landscaping is a dangerous business. Any heavy equipment working in the general area? Big machines or parts under heavy load can sometimes just randomly yeet things quite impressive distances. I, 13 at the time, was about to go to bed. I was brushing my teeth in front of my bedroom window, staring into the dark, when I suddenly heard someone screaming outside. I stopped brushing so I could hear it better. Someone was screaming out my name. I sort of froze and kept listening. More voices joined, all screaming my name and laughing loudly. It was kind of like an audience at a sports game. It went on for about 5 minutes. When it stopped, I, in shock, went downstairs to my parents to ask them if they'd heard anything. It was impossible not to hear as it was very loud. They had not heard anything. I assume it was some sort of a hallucination. Still feel weird when I'm alone in my room late at night. Hypnagogic hallucination? Mine are always auditory like this, and sometimes they happen when I'm really tired. That's just angels cheering you on through a particularly exciting toothbrushing session. It was 9 out of 10 dentists. The 10th one decided to stay in the car because he didn't agree that it was a good method of encouraging dental hygiene in the youth. In my early 20s I was home alone. I woke up to my cell phone ringing but missed the call. The phone number I missed the call from was my home phone number. I got up and found the cordless phone on the kitchen counter. I looked everywhere, but no one was in the house and the doors were all locked. The call was coming from inside the house. Jokes aside, sometimes autodialers can get lucky and randomize a number you have saved. My husband got into an argument with a very confused, grumpy old man once. My husband was in the shower and put his phone on charge. When he got out, he had 3 missed calls. Assuming it was someone that knew him, he called it back. Husband, hi, who's this? I missed 3 calls from you. Old man, why are you asking me who I am? You called me. H, no, you called me 3 times. OM, no, I see right here, you called me 4 times now. Who is this? H, realized what happened, a spoof, apologized and politely got off the call. I can only imagine some disgruntled call center employee was in a bad mood, and just wanted to fuck with people that day. Even if it can be completely explained, how the fuck would you go about getting back to sleep in the middle of the night after that?